Today is going to be complicated, sort of. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and welcome to the Practical Guide to Watch Complications. And what I mean by practical is that this is going to be more of a realistic, grounded look at watch complications, one for the everyday person. So this guide's going to have very little hot horology hype when it comes to history, artistry, and craftsmanship that goes into the watches. And it's really going to be focused more on just how useful these complications are in reality. The way I'm looking at this is that if I had a friend who needed a watch but had no interest in being a watch collector, they just wanted a good, solid, reliable everyday watch, and they needed someone to cut through all the BS, this is what I tell them. Now, I'm going to go over almost every type of watch complication I've run into, and also talk about a few things that are probably not complications, but I think are still important, like tritium, solar, and multiband. And I think this is going to be more useful for newcomers, but could be fun for the seasoned collectors as well, just for a fresh take on some of these, and maybe see how far they've gone down the rabbit hole. So let's start things off by talking about the most common complication out there, a date. Because technically, a date's a complication. And I gotta say, it's a pretty divisive one among watch collectors as well. Some insist on having one, and others hate having a date. Now, in the past, a date was a must-have. But since most of us have a phone in our pocket, it's not quite as necessary. And what it really boils down to is just your own personal preference. Do you like having it, or do you prefer having a cleaner, more symmetric-looking dial? Basically, it's a form versus function argument. But from a practical standpoint, function always trumps over form. And I think having a date is better on an everyday watch. It's a whole lot easier just to flip your wrist to check it than to pull out your phone. However, a date complication, and that's when it says the day of the week on the dial, now that is a little bit of a different story. Where I think some people forget what day of the month it is or just need to be reminded, most of us know what day of the week it is, and typically don't need a reminder. So I don't think it's near as useful as just the date. And worse, most of them just wind up cluttering up the dial, and especially when it's like a Seiko 5 type configuration where it's all over at the right. Although, personally, I do love it when a watch has a full name at the top of the dial, like the Khaki King or a day date. There's something about it I just love looking at. And before we move on, I should also point out that on occasion you will have a day or a date not as a window, but maybe as a subdial or a whole separate hand pointing to something at the edge of the dial. For those, they look awesome, but I think they are a little less functional than just looking at a straight window, as all that extra bit just sort of clutters up the design. Next, let's talk about timing bezels, which is this whole turny thing that's on pretty much every dive watch. Now this, as the name suggests, lets you set a visual timer for something up to an hour. Basically, you just rotate the bezel so that the minute hand lines up with how long you want to set it for. And when that minute hand goes around, it reaches the top of that bezel where the loom pip or whatever it is with that particular design, then that's your cue, time's up. Now, traditionally, this was used for diving just to remind you when to surface. But honestly, you could keep track of just about anything with this. It's really up to you. For instance, when I fly, I usually set the triangle for where the hour hand should be when we land, just to help keep track of how much longer we have in the air. So a timing bezel is simple, straightforward, cheap to implement, and really limited by your own creativity. So I think it's potentially one of the more useful complications out there. But like a lot of things, it also depends on you. And I think the same could be said for a digital timer on a digital watch. The only difference is that it's more useful there, as it will beep to remind you when the time is up. Whereas here, you gotta remember to look down. And along the same lines, but less common, is a 12-hour bezel, which is there to help you keep track of a second time zone, sort of a poor man's GMT. Which I think is less useful than it used to be, since GMTs have become so cheap. But again, it is simple and cheap to implement, and it really doesn't add much to the cost of the watch. So it really depends on if keeping track of a second time zone is something you'd actually use, rather than just go with a simple timing bezel. Up next, let's talk about power reserve indicators, which is also another divisive complication. If you've never seen one, it's basically a subdial that tells you how wound up a mechanical watch is. And you can use that to guess how many hours of power you have left. Now, how useful this is really depends on two things. The first is how many watches you have. Because if you only have a couple and this one is going to be the main watch you wear pretty much every day, then at that point, it's always going to be full and you'll never really need that power reserve indicator. So it's kind of a waste and it does clutter up the dial. But if you have more watches and you're rotating through a few during the week, I've actually found it useful on days I'm not wearing it. Just to pick it up, glance at it, and see if I need to wind it to help it last another few days. So that way I don't need to reset it when I wear it again. The second thing here also depends on how accurate the watch is. Because if the watch is not accurate, like you're losing 15 seconds a day, you might wind up resetting it frequently anyways, just so that you're not completely off. And at that point, power reserve really doesn't matter. On a similar note, you can also apply the same logic to watches with an extended power reserve. You see, a typical entry-level automatic will have about 40 hours of power. But there are plenty of watches out there with longer, like 80 or 72 hours. Which on the surface is a good thing. You can't say more power isn't. But again, in practice, it does get a little bit more complicated. Like again, if it's your main watch, you're always wearing it. At that point, it's always going to be full. So while the extra power is nice, it's not going to be quite as useful. And along the same lines, if the accuracy is really bad, then you don't really want to keep it going anyways, as you're just going to wind up resetting it before it gets way too off. And this is something that I think Seiko has a problem with their 6R series. So either way, you're not really going to take full advantage of that extra power. Now, that said, if you do happen to get a watch with an extended power reserve that's really accurate, it's beautiful, it's fantastic, as it makes a great watch even better. Let's move on to the Perpetual Calendar. Now, as a side note, I'm wearing my Casio Oceanus just because it's pretty complicated and it's got a lot of these complications, including that Perpetual Calendar, which is when you have a watch that knows exactly how many days there are in the month, just so that you don't have to adjust it if you have less than 31 when the next month starts. Now, this is arguably one of the most useful complications out there, and especially if you want a watch that looks great and just works. But here there are really two sides to this. You have the mechanical side and you have the quartz side. For the mechanical side, just don't even think about it. Those watches are extremely complicated to make, meaning it's going to be pretty pricey, like expensive for luxury pricey. And servicing it will also become a nightmare in terms of cost. So it's really hard to justify one of those on a practical level. But on the quartz side, have at it, as pretty much every digital watch is already a perpetual calendar. And there are a fair amount of analog watches that are quartz that you also don't have to sell a kidney to get. Now, some of those can be a little more complicated to set up, but once you do, if you see something you really like that has it, it's icing on the cake. Next up, chronographs, or if you got a digital watch, it's called a stopwatch, which if you think about it is really the opposite of a timer or a timing bezel, as instead of counting down, you're counting up to see how long something takes to happen. On the digital side of all this, it's typically already integrated in. I mean, pretty much every digital Casio's got one, so it doesn't cost you anymore and it's going to be as useful as you make it. But on the analog side, that gets a little bit more complicated, as a chronograph pretty much takes over the entire watch. It's a dedicated watch just for that. And all that complication is going to make a little bit more of a messy design, where some of that focus is taken off the time-telling bits just to make room for all the chronograph parts. Now, personally, I really do like chronographs, but if I'm being completely honest, I like them more for the look than the functionality, as the few times I've actually been using them for just that really doesn't justify having a dedicated design. You may be different though, but because of that, I do think that if you're wanting a chronograph, regular quartz is the way to go. I mean, practically every watch collector does dream of having some sort of mechanical or automatic chronograph, usually like an Omega Speedmaster. But from a practical standpoint, which is what we're talking here, good old affordable reliable quartz is the way to go. And not even mecha quartz, I'm talking regular old quartz. As Mecha Quartz, which is sort of this hybrid system, I've found to be a little bit less reliable than just a regular quartz movement, as sometimes that chronograph hand doesn't return all the way up, whereas if it's quartz, there's always some sort of setting to readjust that hand. Plus, bonus points if it's solar. And as long as we're talking about chronographs, let's talk about tachymeters and the lesser known telemeters. And yes, there's one on my Oceanus. Now, these are not very useful in my opinion, but the odds are if you're going to get a chronograph, you'll automatically have one on it. It's pretty uncommon not to. Now, if you're not familiar, they're basically that marked bezel thing on the outside of most chronographs. And the way you use them is that when you stop the chronograph, you see where the second hand stops and reference it on that bezel. And it tells you something. Like with the tachymeter, it tells you the frequency something is occurring, and it's most often used to tell you the speed of a car over a set distance. So it has a deep history in racing history, while a telemeter is used to tell you how far away something is. Like with lightning, you see the flash, you start it, and then stop it when you hear the thunder. It's kind of like that old adage that every second is a mile, but here it's a little bit more accurate. Now, on the surface, in certain situations, both of these could be useful. But for the most part, watch designers are just including them for the sake of tradition. And the trick is, most people don't really know what they're there for or even how to use them. So like I said, if you buy a chronograph, you're probably going to have one on it. You may already. But just like everybody else, you almost never use it. Although, if you really want to talk about useless complications, the worst is up next. Because here we're going to talk about that dreaded 24-hour subdial, which for whatever reason winds up on a lot of Japanese chronographs. You see, normally you have a subdial for the running seconds, you have one for the minute elapsed, and then there's always this random 24-hour subdial just sitting there because. I've never really figured out why they keep including it. And it also shows up on some multifunction watches as well. But no matter where it sits, it's equally as useless. Because it's not tracking a separate time zone, it's not a dual time thing. It just shows you the hour on a 24-hour scale. Basically telling you if you're an AM or PM, of which you probably already know just by looking outside. So unless you're underground or in a submarine, there's not much point to this. But again, for some reason, they just keep putting them on watches. And sometimes that 24-hour subdial even gets dressed up a bit as a sun and moon subdial, which is where they replace the hand with a rotating disc, one that has a big ol' sun for noon and a moon for midnight. And it rotates around over the course of the day. And the one I always think about is the Orient Sun and Moon. Now the design can be pretty, but it's still not that useful. And most of the time, it's just sort of set up as this cheap substitute for a Moonphase. And speaking of which, you might as well talk about that. Now, a Moonphase is one of the more interesting and elegant complications around. And most of the time, it's a disk that's set to do a full rotation in 29.5 days, which is the full lunar cycle. So it is a bit of a specialty complication. And the whole purpose is to literally let you know what phase of the moon is in at a glance. So it's interesting, it's elegant, and pretty cool to see. But in terms of usefulness, practically speaking, it's not that useful. And unless you happen to be a first responder or work in an emergency room, most of us don't really care if it's a full moon. For us, it's just a really cool extra feature or something you're going to talk about when you show somebody the watch. And as long as we're talking about useless things, let's talk about a slide ruler. And these are most often found on aviation watches. This is something like you'd find on a Navitimer or maybe the more affordable Citizen Nighthawk. Now technically, these slide rulers are kind of a form of a flight computer. And if you know how to use it and you're a pilot, this could definitely be handy in a pinch to figure something out. Like how much fuel you're going to use or the time or distance to something. But that's a pretty limited use, and most of the people that have these on their watches actually have no idea how to use them. It's sort of the equivalent of having a dive watch but never going diving. You just kind of have it because it's cool. So these will probably never be used, and for the few people who might actually use them, they probably have an app on their phone that does it better. So this would just be a backup. So they're cool from an aesthetic and historic standpoint, but for most of us, they're pretty useless. Which brings us to the GMTs. And I think this is true of GMTs of all types, whether you're talking callers, travelers, and some of the more unusual hybrid systems out there. And once again, this is going to be a bit divisive, and it also really depends on you. GMTs are designed to keep track of a second and sometimes third time zone. And as such, it does complicate the dial just a little bit. So if you're someone that likes clean and simple designs, odds are you don't really like GMTs. But there are some, and I'm one, who actually like that little bit of added complication. I think it makes a more interesting watch. But let's get back to how useful this is. And realistically, if you're not interested in keeping track of more than one time zone, it's not that useful. And in the past, the GMT argument was pretty simple and straightforward. As you see, just a couple of years ago, the cheapest caller's GMT was about $500 to $600, if you were lucky. And after that, it went up pretty quickly. Then if you wanted a true or traveler's GMT, you're talking thousands. So GMTs weren't cheap. And until recently, unless you actually traveled frequently, it was pretty hard to justify getting one. But then, about 2 years ago, Seiko came out with their NH34 caller's GMT movement, which really isn't more than a regular three-handed NH35. And then Citizen/Miyota followed that up with their own reasonably priced 9075 Travelers or True GMT movement. And the introduction of both of those radically changed everything. Because these days, you can get a GMT for just about the same price as a regular three-hander. And unless you absolutely hate the design or hate seeing that extra little hand, why not? As most of the GMT designs I've seen, they add a little bit more complication, but not that much. And at the same time, they're going to have just about the same footprint and the same level of comfort. So you're really just getting a little bit more added functionality at the same price. Even if you might only use that GMT a few times a year, when you do, it'll come in handy. So while I know some of you are absolutely sick of all these new GMTs coming out, I'm one of the people that are all for them. But before we move on, just one quick word about the whole callers versus travelers GMT movement thing. Despite what some people say, neither is ultimately better than the other. They both have their strengths and weaknesses. The only real limitation is you and how well you can adapt to using them. And if you're trying to figure out which one you should actually get, well, the key is in the name. If you're going to be traveling, Traveler's GMT is better. If you just want to keep track of another time zone, that's where Caller's GMT is better. Anyway, next up, we're going to talk about kind of a subset of GMTs with world timers. And world timers really come in two types. You have the analog watch with a rotating bezel, sometimes of which will have a GMT, and I've seen a few without. And then you have the digital world timers, which are just a whole other mode. In either case, they can come in handy if you aren't sure what time zone a particular city is in, because the whole point is they're sort of set up to reference that. As long as you know where you're at, you could tell what time some other city's at. Now, for most digital watches, like the Casio Royale, a world timer is a really nice feature to have, as when you're traveling, you just sort of switch over and switch to the city you're at. It's really that simple. But when you're talking analog watches, now they do have their use, but sometimes there's also going to be a little bit of a learning curve that goes with it. And the designs of these world timers are often much more crowded and chaotic than a regular GMT, which ultimately would be my recommendation. Just go with a simpler GMT. There's also some of these weird hybrid systems, and each one of those is going to work a little bit differently. And how useful they are is really going to depend on how it was designed. For instance, on my Casio Oceanus, it's sort of this dual time / world time thing. When you first look at the watch, it's really chaotic and really confusing as what it's actually doing. But once you figure it out and get over that learning curve, it actually works really well. Yet at the same time, I've seen some others that I still have no idea how they work. Which is something you could say about a pulsometer, at least when you first see one, because it does look a little strange at first. Now, this is a pretty rare complication, and I've seen them on both a chronograph and a regular three-hander. It's kind of similar to Tachymeter, but here it's made to help you determine someone's heart rate. And in some ways, seeing a design like this come to life is really a bit of just cool retro watch history. But again, yeah, you guessed it, these aren't really that useful. As these days, there are many devices that will automatically and probably more accurately tell you someone's heart rate. And out of the few physicians I've shown this to, they weren't impressed. Most of the time, they just replied, "It's not that hard to multiply by 4." Now, I'm not sure if this is a complication or just a type of watch, but for number 15, we're going to talk about Ani-Digi. And when it comes to Ani-Digi, no watch is as well known as the Ani. And as cool as the Ani is, I gotta say, I don't really get Ani-Digi watches. Some say it's the best of both worlds, but I've always seen them as kind of this compromise between the two, where neither part is really as good as a dedicated watch. Now, in some Ani-Digis, I think there is an advantage if you could have 2 different time zones shown. One on the digital and one on the analog part. But I've always found the smaller LCD really hard to read. And having a dual system always makes setting up that analog part a little bit more complicated. So for me, I say if you're going to go analog, go analog. You want to go digital, go digital. And Ani-Digi is best left to Hollywood. Which brings us to a Tourbillon. And I gotta say that out of all the complications in the history of horology, that a Tourbillon is easily the most mesmerizingly beautiful. It's just breathtaking. Just look at it, take a deep breath, and it brings over a sense of Zen-like peace. Which is why it kind of pains me to say that it's also one of the most expensive, useless pieces of horological history ever created. One of those solutions in search of a problem. Now, I get why people obsess over them when you've never actually seen one, but once you have, you kind of get over it. Theoretically, since it is rotating around, it is supposed to be more accurate, as it negates any positional irregularities a regular movement would have. But other than the random off-brand Chinese tourbillons out there, they're outrageously expensive. And if accuracy is really the name of the game, it's what you want, there are so many more efficient ways and cheaper ways to do it. So, useless. Next up, let's talk about the jumping hour complication, which is when the watch is missing an hour hand, but it has a window that shows you the hour. It's a really cool and interesting way to show you the time. And depending on the design, it can be pretty easy and straightforward to read as well. Whereas with some others, well, I'll just show you this. But generally, it is pretty easy to read. Now, the movement used in these is usually pretty specialized. So there are really only 2 different types of jumping hours out there. The first one is the really expensive luxury watches. And the second is the cheaper Chinese ones, with nothing really in between. And because of that, the practical thing would be to avoid them. Because you either have a watch that's ridiculously expensive, or one that comes with a movement that doesn't have as a reliable track record. So if you're a collector who's curious and wants to add one, go for it. Depending on the watch, they could be pretty fun and interesting. But if you're just looking for a good, solid, reliable everyday watch, they're not one I'd recommend. Now at this point, we're going to leave the complications and more move on to the types of watches or features of particular watches. And first, let's talk solar, as in solar movement. And the short version is that if you're going to go with a Quartz watch, solar is the best way to do it. The only downside is it might cost a little bit more than just a normal straight Quartz watch, but not much more. That, and sometimes the dials might not look as good as other watches, just because they have to be a little bit transparent to let the light through. Although I've seen some pretty good solar watches, and that's not always the case. And most of them say that when they're fully charged, they could run for 6 months in complete darkness. But you don't want to wait that long, just make sure you get a little sun here and there. Now at some point you may need to change the battery on them, but we're talking like at least 10 years, if not longer. I got one watch that's 20 years old, and it's running fine. But even if you do, at that point, you might want a whole new watch anyways. And along the same lines, we might as well talk about Seiko's line of Kinetic watches, which I think they've finally given up on. Maybe. If not, they really should. Now, Kinetic watches are Quartz watches, but it's set up a little bit differently that it has a rotor like an automatic. But instead of winding up a spring, that rotor actually spins a little tiny generator to create power, which is then stored in a battery. And like solar, they say when it's fully charged, you get about 6 months of power before having to add any more. So in some ways, you could say that a kinetic movement actually has some advantages over solar, and that you don't actually need full sun, you just gotta wear them. And the trick is that if it's your primary watch, the watch you wear constantly, I think they're actually a good idea. But if not, just avoid them. And I'm saying this as someone who used to wear a Kinetic and wore one almost every day for a decade. That was before I really got into collecting. So while the whole idea of it sounds great, the thing is they take a lot to charge up. So if you're only wearing it every other day or so, it's not going to get enough to keep on going long term. At which point you're going to pick it up, you're going to do this whole little spinny action thing. I'm telling you from experience, just to kind of jumpstart it, just so that you can get it going enough to wear throughout the day. And for the next day or so, it's going to do this whole double tick thing, telling you it's got low power. And by the way, again, telling you from firsthand experience, the rotor on these things is really loud. If you think a Miyota rotor is loud, you haven't heard one of these. Bottom line, it's a great idea that just doesn't really pan out, because in practice, solar is the more straightforward, foolproof approach. Now, if you're someone that values accuracy and a regular quartz watch isn't quite accurate enough for you, well, that's where the HAQ or high accuracy quartz watches come in. You see, a regular quartz movement's going to be accurate to about 15 to 20 seconds a month. But for high accuracy, you're talking more like 5 to 10 seconds a year. So where with a regular quartz watch, after about a year, you might be 4 to 5 minutes off. With high accuracy, you're still spot on. And typically this is done with a higher grade of quartz, specially cut crystals, and special systems to help stabilize the crystal's temperature. Thermoregulation, as they call it. Now, it's pretty hard to argue that more accuracy and more reliability is a bad thing. But how useful it actually is and how practical a particular watch is really depends on how much they are and how that particular watch is set up. Most high accuracy watches are in the thousands, and at that point it's pretty hard to argue for them when you can get a Casio with multiband, or Bluetooth, which can sync itself externally for a fraction of that. Although the thing is, they aren't all that pricey, and some of them are quite reasonable. Bulova has its Precisionist line. There's also some Tissot's and Certinas with what I think they call the Percadrive. And Longines used to have their VHP Conquest line, and they're kind of phasing it out, and you can find some of those on clearance. So you can get some high accuracy watches without going too crazy. But how it's implemented really tells you how useful it is. Like with the Precisionist. You see, those are really just a regular three-hander that's a lot more accurate, as well as just having this really smooth sweep. But since it's just a regular three-hander, that means twice a year with daylight savings, you're still gonna have to stop it and reset it. And that admittedly defeats the whole purpose of high accuracy. But then there are watches like my Longines, which has a perpetual calendar, as well as it knows when daylight savings is. And that has been a true set it and forget it wonder. Or recently, I got a new Citizen Chronomaster, and it also has a perpetual calendar. Now, it doesn't know daylight savings, but it does have a jumping hour hand, kind of like a Traveler's GMT. So even when you need to update the watch for daylight savings, or say when you're traveling, you don't need to fully stop it and reset it. You just adjust the hour. And I gotta hand it to Citizen, that's pretty smart. But as I was saying, as much as I like high accuracy quartz watches, when you look at them practically, and you look at the other options that can sync externally, it's pretty hard to argue for them. And that's something you could also say about Seiko's spring drive. Now, I haven't talked about this much, but recently I did buy a used Grand Seiko, just because I always wanted to watch with a spring drive. So I can now say firsthand, a spring drive is a true wonder of the watch world. It's a complicated hybrid system that sits in between a regular automatic and a quartz movement. And if you look into how it works, it really is amazing what it can do. But all that amazement comes at a pretty steep price. And it's really hard to argue for it from a practical standpoint. I mean, if you really love that smooth sweep, Bulova's Precisionist watches have a pretty similar sweep. It's not quite the same, but it's almost as good. And as for accuracy, I think a spring drive is rated about 15 seconds a month, which is amazing for a mechanical system, but that's just standard for quartz. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's stop talking about movements and now start talking about features, like the ABCs. Which, unless you're a G-Shock fan, you probably don't know what the heck I'm talking about. But we're talking A for altimeter, B for barometer, and C for compass, which are features that are found on a lot of G-Shocks and a few other watches like my Garmin. Now, obviously, if you never leave the house or venture off the beaten track, these won't be very useful for you. But if you do, I think they can come in handy, or at least the compass can. As the only time I think an altimeter would come in handy is if you're worried about altitude sickness. And at that point, you should probably already be aware of it. And as for a barometer, I've heard that a barometer can really save your life. That I can tell you when rain's coming and you can take shelter. But that's only if you really know how to read it. Whereas a compass is a compass, and most of us can figure that out. And speaking of Casios, let's talk about multiband, everyone's favorite feature on a Casio, as it's on a lot of inexpensive Casios, as well as some other watches from other brands. And everyone loves it because it ensures accuracy by syncing the watch up with the atomic clock. But the trick is that it's not universally useful for everyone. And I think that's something a lot of people forget, as there really are only a handful of signal towers in the entire world. It's called Multiband 6 because there are only 6 towers in the entire world. And your watch, when it syncs to it in the middle of the night, has to be able to receive that signal in order to be useful. So you gotta be within range of one of those towers, and the watch has to be in a place that isn't gonna have any interference, which means it's gonna get a lot better signal on your windowsill than sitting in your watch box in your closet or in your dresser drawer. And the question is, how often do you remember to put it near that windowsill? And that is really the trick with multiband. Now, obviously it's better to have it than not, but I think a lot of people overestimate its usefulness. That's kind of my hot take on it. And along the same lines, I'm willing to say that Bluetooth is actually more useful, which is something I think many of you are going to disagree with. You see, more and more watches these days are coming with Bluetooth functionality, and sometimes it is for more smartwatchy features. But sometimes it's there just to help sync the time. And if you want your watch to always be accurate for everyday use, I think that's the way to go. And it's also useful when traveling. Last January, I flew to Florida to run a half marathon, and I brought my Garmin running watch with me. But I did fly with my GMT. Now, the night before the race, I remembered I should take out my Garmin and just sync it up, so that way I'm not late getting to the race. But when I pulled it out, I realized it was already set, and you can't beat that. The only real downside, or the critical weakness when it comes to Bluetooth syncing, is that you of course need a phone to sync it to. If you don't have that, or maybe your phone is dead, you're kind of out of luck. And for those that want a watch to be completely independent and self-sufficient, I think that is a valid concern. But if that's the case, then that's also kind of where a GPS system comes in. And I'm not talking navigation, but we are using those exact same satellites, as there are some watches out there that can use the GPS signals to actually sync up their watch. This is something that's a little bit newer, but not that new. And unless you're looking at running watches, which have other GPS features, it's not overly common. But Seiko and Citizen have some watches with these abilities. And theoretically, it should be able to accurately set the time almost anywhere in the world. The downside, again, is that it's not as common. It can be more pricey and be more power hungry. But if that's important to you, it's one way to do it. But the thing is, I think for most people in the world, Bluetooth is just the keep it simple solution. And last, but certainly not least, we're going to talk about Tritium. And this is going to be another bit of a hot take, because many people out there think Tritium is the end all to be all for Lume. But I think it's actually overrated for most people. And before you start yelling at me in the comments, remember this is coming to you from someone who has degrees in chemistry, in case you've forgotten or you're new to the channel. And I'm looking at it from that perspective, where that shortened half-life of 12.33 years is a liability compared to traditional phosphorescent lume. The thing is, most people think of tritium like it's a flashlight with a battery, but it's much more complicated, as each tube is lined with a fluorescent coating, which is then powered by the decay of the tritium atoms, with each atom only being able to decay once. That's it, there's no recharging it. So whereas a flashlight is able to maintain its light intensity till about when the battery runs out, a tritium tube is actually getting dimmer and dimmer every second that goes by. It's just so slight that you're not actually noticing it from day to day, but after 12 years it will be half as bright as it used to be. And the thing to remember is that whole half-life thing doesn't start when you bought the watch, or only counts when you're wearing it, but that half-life begins the moment that tube was filled, which is one reason I don't recommend buying any used watch with tritium. You just don't know how much life is left. Now, the obvious advantage of tritium is that it glows throughout the night on its own. And for a few people, it actually makes a perfect watch. Like if you're a first responder, you're working a night shift, that's a perfect watch for you. And if that's you, you should look into getting one. But if your tritium-based watch spends most nights in a watch box in your closet or in a drawer, then the truth is that tritium is being wasted. And when you consider that most tritium watches cost more and then that shortened lifespan, I just don't think most people are going to get their money's worth out of it. So it is great for some, but for most people, I think they're better off with just traditional lume. And especially since traditional lume usually glows brighter for the first 20 to 30 minutes than a tritium-based watch will. After that, the tritium then takes over. But if you're actually diving or you're going in and out of dark spaces, as most of us do throughout the day, and at that point your eyes haven't quite adjusted to the darkness, then that brighter light is actually easier to see. So regular lume is more cost effective, it lasts longer, and for most people, I think it just makes more sense. And with that, we're done. Now, I know this has been a long one, but I did want to make this a bit more comprehensive. So thanks for joining me, and thank you for making it to the end. And if you have any questions or you disagree with me on a few of these points, make sure you leave it down below in the comments. Otherwise, you guys know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.